well validated, and they are very well supported with documentary. It's impossible to silence silent disinformation and to hide disinformation, because if you silence disinformation in Bulgaria, we have an impact outside, we have an impact abroad, and after that, it's an absurd, but we notice this phenomenon. We have a second impact, re-impact in Bulgaria, but impact from the biggest European or USA media, which quoted our information and our investigations. That's the situation.
Thank you. So we need the mass media. Okay, I want now to give the floor to our participants here on the panel again, I think.
Hello? Are you ignoring me? I have a question, please. I'm standing here for 15 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much.
My deepest apology.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
But nonetheless, I wanted to finish my sentence. Okay. I would like to give the floor then to the participants here, that you maybe think in a very brief, what was the main, let's say, result so far, what is important for you to speak, and of course we want to have as many contributions as possible, and how could I overlook you? Terrible. Can I later invite you for? No, that's too stupid.
I only have a short question, so don't worry, okay? It will be really fast. I have a question for you, Ms. Jackson, because I think I just got you wrong, because I was totally confused by the Through the Wall. You were saying that internet is creating different standards everywhere, or you wanted to say that like there are different standards of internet everywhere? Because like for me, it's like when you have a democratic internet, like we should have in European Union, it's like creating a common base for everyone, that everyone had access to the same things, so there's no difference. But I think I just got you wrong, so could you please like repeat that?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anyone else who I did not look at? I wanted to come to back to you when we go in the but at the very end, because you want to speak about the development of television, right? Oh, if you want to pose a question to the topic so far, then it's fine. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. I would like to compliment the reviews of Mrs. Lizzie. And you mentioned Netflix, you mentioned new paradigms, new business models. What we see now is that TV constructors, TV stations, content producers, ISPs are all trying to deliver media. And they all build their own, or with cooperation with other partners, paradigms, platforms, business models, which compete maybe each other. What I would like to note, my remark in this point, is that all this new delivery, this new channel, has all the problems of internet we are discussing here, such as net neutrality, privacy, security issues, and so on.
Thank you, Evgenios. Evgenios Nassos from the Greek Ministry of Communication or something like that? No, from from Information Communication, so I was not too wrong. Anybody else who wants to pose a direct question to one of our experts here on the panel? I mean, we all are experts, we all should talk to each other here, but anybody else who says he has an urgent question to one of the panelists to answer? Yes, Giacomo, EBU, you ask your own expert or something else? Would you come over to the mic, please? So we finish in about 10 to 15 minutes just for the cooks out who are preparing the lunch.
No, I will not ask to my colleague because I can see him in the office every day. The question is for all the panel, and I'm starting from a reflection that made Ross 1 hour ago. It's about the approach to the printed media and the serendipity that it comes when you read the newspaper. I totally share the behavior But I totally disagree on the fundament of what you say, because this is not serendipity. This is the hard work of journalists that mediate between the interests of the citizens and their own view of the world. And they try to bring the information that they think are relevant to the audience through the newspaper. You call it serendipity. We call this the results of professionalism and investment. Investment that public service media last year spent 7 billion euros in producing that kind of quality contents. So compared to 125 million that I would like to understand more what you mean in terms of investment in the
Ross,
content.
could you answer that in your final statement? Then, because I'm just collecting some points. Could you?
I agree with you. That is curation and that is journalism. For me, as the reader, it's serendipity, because I open the newspaper, Sunday New York Times, and I spend 2 hours, and my world becomes broader because of the hard work of the journalism at the New York Times. So we don't have a disagreement. For me, the experience is serendipity, because I don't have to do that hard work. The New York Times does it for me. You have a couple of questions, I think,
okay,
that you should probably...
Please, we have one more statement, I think, from Wolf. Do you want? Yes? Well, because it's you, I give you one. Normally, I don't hand it out exact him. Yes.
There was much reference made to importance and relevance of public service media. And as a journalist, I have defended over more than 40 years public broadcasting model. What made me completely frustrated over the last 5 years, seeing public broadcasters copying private channels in a way which is sometimes shameless, neglecting quality standards, and being paid by the public. So I have all understanding for private TV to look for quotas and to have sometimes a program which doesn't comply with my quality expectations. But
pay your public fee anyway, right?
Yeah, but
okay.
If the public broadcasters are doing the same programming as a private, I think it's not my public broadcasting anymore.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Euro, you were really so patient waiting all the time. Or Lizzie wants to start first, okay, because you have the mic, and then it's Euro. Yes, okay. Lizzie, okay?
To draw together some of those threads, there needs to be support for the evolution of some of these organizations that have existed in a traditional media framework. Ross and I were talking about this earlier, the need for education and for universities to create courses to educate people to do top-up skills for journalists and young people coming in to learn the new skills of mediation of the new media landscape. Things like data journalism, which will create lots of new jobs for journalists. But also techniques such as the mediation techniques, which introduce standards in non-linear interactive environments, and techniques to increase the findability of content, such as swarming, how to create a meme and to move people around. And once you've got them in a sort of swarm, then you can put quality media into that swarm. It's a new sort of version of the audience. So there are new ethics and standards emerging, but I think the most important thing that's come out of here is what's a fantastic academic called Roger Silverstone called keeping a proper distance or having a proper distance. And that's having wide enough selection of material so you get a 360-degree view. I talked to a friend of mine the other day who works at Hewlett-Packard creating algorithms. I said to her, could there be a public service algorithm? She said, yes, you could do it. You could do it so that you could tag content so that what's pulled out using predictive analytics or whatever is a public service type of selection of content, and it could be tagged as such. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is to is just to make sure that public service media are supported and are able to move online or get online or to operate online. I know in Germany there are copyright issues and content has to be taken down. But the European Declaration and Recommendation, March 2012, that the European Council of Europe was passed at the Council of Europe, will really help with this.
Okay, Euro. Thank you very much, Lizzie. Euro.
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps when I took the floor at the beginning, maybe I was a little bit too on the negative side because, of course, all these new technologies, they give fantastic tools for journalists, professional journalists, and everybody. The problem is that media houses, instead of using those opportunities for improving the quality, they just make do with fewer journalists, and this is one of the worrying trends. On the question of public service, public broadcasting, there's one tendency, at least in Finland right now, that private-owned media want to fence in the public broadcasting company into a certain area. I mean, they should not, according to the private media, the public broadcasting company should not be allowed to diversify into other areas using, of course, the internet and all these new technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ross, anything else you want to add?
I just wanted to, I'm glad we've had this discussion, and I'm very appreciative of the questions raised and the issues that we need to face. But I want to remind us of the incredible diversity of knowledge and viewpoints that are available now because of the internet, which were never available before. And that needs to be the baseline agreement, I think, for all of us as we address the challenges. I think about myself as a kid. You know, I was fairly precocious and I had views on any number of issues, and my ability to speak to the world was so limited as a child. My parents, my teachers, if I were lucky enough and I wrote a letter to the editor and that editor found it worthy, maybe it would get published in the local newspaper. And now when we think about the ability of anyone with an internet connection today to speak to millions of voices, it's really a profound change. It's disruptive and there are challenges, but we need to maintain an appreciation for this democratization of viewpoints that we're all able to benefit from. And I think that's incredibly important.
Thank you very much. Elvana, do you want?
Yes.
You posed so many questions. I think not all were answered, but we are going on after lunch break. Yes.
I think what Ross said earlier, the experience, the reader's experience, and what Giacomo said, the information, actually, the quality of information, this is really the heart of the debate. Whether information is experience or is something else, is the basis for self-fulfillment, is the basis for self-development, is the basis for democratic discourse, for plurality of ideas and points of view. My plea is for all the policymakers to start becoming aware of the challenges, to start becoming aware of this dichotomy, and to think about these solutions, which are not going to be easy and not always are going to be regulation. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Elvana. Roberto?
I personally think that what Ross was explaining is very true. But at the same time, isn't it a bit of a mirage sometimes? Can I really reach millions of people? How many times this happened? Very few. If any regular person with a Twitter account, how many people in the world have a Twitter account or are in Facebook? And what are your connections? I'm not saying it's not true. And some people, influencers, can be very public. So I would say, yes, that's true, but at the same time, we should not be afraid because of regulation and of trying as citizens to be able, through our representatives, to set rules in the markets, so the markets, again, are not only chasing economic profitability, but profitability for the citizens. Having said that, I would like to emphasize that public service media should not be seen as that bunker in the past, only based on regulation and in front of or a competitor to commercial media, or I would say not only commercial media, but many other players in the market. We actually need to cooperate, and this is already happening. And across Europe, we see in many situations where public service media and commercial media are working together to bring the citizens quality entertainment, quality news, quality content. So I would say we need to live together. And I think it's better that we start to cooperate and we start to do things together, because otherwise what is going to happen is that the citizens, as you said, thanks to the capabilities of technology, are going to get tired of these fights and they will go somewhere else to get their content.
Okay, last but not least, Asim, please.
Yeah, let me mention one example how internet helps civil society fight the corruption. Hours ago, we published a video file revealing how inspector from the State Inspectorate of Traffic wants a bribe from a Turkish truck driver. We received this video and we revealed that immediately. Internet gives the chance of civil society fighting the corruption when the system is trying to keep this problem inside it, not revealing it spread out. So I want to finish mentioning that I used to work for 20 years in conventional media, in newspapers. I had to migrate in internet to keep the mission of journalism, of genuine journalism, to supply a good and professional information, to give the chance of alternative tribune, free and responsible, which is not governed by the stress of censorship and auto-censorship. And all these things I can get, and I can work in this situation thanks to the possibilities of digital media, of internet. So it's very important to have the chance working such a journalistic profession, because it's very vital and truly necessary for any democratic society.
Okay, thank you very much. Was very good, I think, final remark. I just want to remind you, please, we have a breakout session going on, especially with the question of how is journalism working now in these days, what's the future of journalism, and so on. And you will also have a keynote talk, I think, introduction to the topic. So please also advertise for this breakout session. Come to this one. This is, of course, the best one, just after the lunch break. I may ask Thomas now also, please brief, but you're the rapporteur. What did you take out of our session?
Thank you, and thank you for trying to herd this wild kettle of very engaged people. It was really great to listen to you. So I try to be brief. What I take away is that we have seen a transformation of the media ecosystem and also of the use of media that go in different directions, and there are very diverging interpretations of what is good or bad about this development and what should be done about it. So we face a proliferation of information and media services, in particular online. Social media, citizen journalism, etc., have added new applications and new uses and are challenging the use and business models of traditional media actors. Notion of media has changed or has been expanded or diversified. We all agree that we have more information and communication available in quantity, but there is not really an agreement whether we have more in quality and in diversity, and whether we have more media freedom or more individual freedom. And one of the key challenges for users is the question of trust. In particular, young users seem to have lost trust in traditional media actors. They rely more on social media, on their own friends, and on platforms that offer interaction with their friends. But at the same time, also, good question would be why. That hasn't been discussed. Maybe that's a question that we could follow up with the young people in the breakout session. Why have you lost trust in traditional media actors? But there are also some risks with these new structures. One of them being a narrowing effect due to the customization of information delivery, that you get what you want and you fail to see what maybe others are concerned, but not you directly. The issue of whether these platforms are becoming gatekeepers is something that has been discussed. And then, of course, the question of more or less freedom, I will come to that. One thing that has not changed is that media is still the main tool for people to form their opinions and to build their reality, to expand their personal reality. There were two focuses of the debate. One was the discussion about diversity and quality in media journalism. The behavior of all the new actors was questioned and judged and evaluated very differently depending on the experience, on the personal experiences of the people. And then also the requests about a transformation of public service media to maybe public service journalism, and questions about regulation, protection, and also responsibilization of new media actors was discussed, and we hope that we will continue on this after that in the breakout session. And the whole question of media regulation and why and what for and why not. And then finally, and I'll end with this, is that we have heard by several speakers that there seems to be a development in some European countries, in particular in Eastern European countries, where the relationship between politics and media is changing, has been changing in the past years. It has been claimed that there are more attempts to influence and control the media by governments, and this development is worrying, and we should all have a closer look at this and look at what is going on to get a real picture and then take actions in all our institutions that we work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I thank all the panelists. I thank also all the organizers who have been prepared. This, I think, very interesting panel with a lot of stuff to think about. Bon appetit, and see you later. Thank you very much.
искаш да затвориш? Едно, три, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1.
Prova, 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 prova. Сейчас. Prova, prova, prova. Test pro 6, test 1, 2. Test, okay. Test 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Test 1, 2, 2, 2, 2. 2, 2, 2. Test 1, 2, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Test. 1, 1. Yes. Test. 6, 7, 8. Test. Let me see the second speaker. Test. Okay. Is it enough?
Test, 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 test. Yeah, it's working. Good.
A, da. Test poraba, test.
Yeah.
Test. Окей, минава средата, нали? Тест. Средата минава, индикацията. Тест.
Who press it? Can you switch off my mic, please? Until it starts. Thank you.
Тест, 1, 2. Така по-добре ли? Тест. Ага. Тест. И те не вярвам да я ритат. Тест.
Затвори си хед.
Да. Добре, ти се не гласи, почна с това микрофона.
Аз съвсем. Ами сега ще го заместим. Мога да го направя.
Thank you. Here, give this. Hello, everybody. I think we're about to start. Some people are coming still in from the lunch. Welcome to this session on the cross-border internet and law, what frameworks. My name is Paul Fellinger. I'm the manager of the Internet and Jurisdiction Project, which is a global multi-stakeholder dialogue process to develop a transnational due process framework. I am very happy to have extremely distinguished speakers today on this panel. So we have Elvana Taci from the Council of Europe, who's working in the Department for Information Society. We have Megan Richards, who is the Director for Coordination in DG Connect at the European... Oh, what is your... Principal Advisor. Sorry for that. So the Principal Advisor. We have Kostas Rozoglu, who's the head of EU policy of Yelp. And we have Gabrielle Gumin, who's from Article 19, the legal officer. Of course, the cross-border internet and the patchwork of different national jurisdictions is one of the hottest topics in the global internet governance space. We are in a situation today where our national legal frameworks are still based on the geographical conception of territorial sovereignty, whereas we have multiple cyberspaces that span across all those different countries. And this poses a completely new set of challenges and issues. And the goal today is to better understand what actually those challenges are, and also what are the possibilities to move forward and to find ways for cooperation and for operational solutions. So I had a look at the high-level cases that we saw in Europe over the last few months that actually showed this tension. And there were 3 cases that especially drew my attention. And one is obviously the question of extraterritorial extension of sovereignty with regards to data access. So there's a case in the United States, a New York court wants to have access to data stored on Microsoft's servers in the Irish jurisdiction. There are other cases, for instance, before the European Court of Human Rights, there's the Delphi versus Estonia case that will set new standards probably on the responsibility of intermediaries to act upon requests for content removal. But also, and very famously, there's the decision by the Court of Justice of the European Union on the right to be de-indexed, which of course poses a whole lot of new questions on how private actors and if private actors should do determinations on individual cases, what are the procedures, and so on and so forth. And of course, the whole thematic cluster of online terrorism, the responsibilities of the different internet companies in that regard, the role of terms of services that has been very much discussed in recent months. Those are all hot topics. And I would like to start this, this panel discussion by painting a bit the landscape and shedding a bit more light on the complexities we're actually facing. And I would like to make a very quick round with interventions of like 3 minutes of the panelists. And I would like to start with Elvana. The Council of Europe has been working a lot on recommendations of how the rule of law or national laws apply on the cross-border internet. Can you tell us a bit more about the work that is going on and the results that you achieved in that regard?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Paul. Since 2009, after a ministerial conference in Reykjavik, we engaged with the notion of the cross-border nature of the internet. And it was felt in the Council of Europe intergovernmental structures that we needed to acknowledge the nature of the internet, its cross-border nature, its value as a public resource in policy. Now, why is this necessary? It is necessary because, for example, if you look at the internet from a freedom of expression point of view, freedom of expression applies not only to the content, but also to the means of distribution of content, of information, to the means of transmission of information. And the court has actually, the European Court of Human Rights, which is based in Strasbourg, has affirmed this, has pronounced this very important principle, that Article 10, freedom of expression, as enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights, applies not only to the information, but to the means of transmission of information.
Also across borders?
It has not, the court did not engage with that nature. But this statement signifies the importance of acknowledging in policy the value of the infrastructure, of the means of transmission. And of course, the means of transmission is cross-borders. So this is why it was felt necessary in the Council of Europe to engage with this notion of cross-border nature of the internet and to have it in policy. We developed in 2011 a recommendation to member states on the universality, integrity, and openness of the internet. What that recommendation does is that it sets out a commitment, principles for a commitment to be taken by member states to preserve the integrity of the internet, the infrastructure. And it elaborates due diligence principles of cooperation between states. For example, in cases of emergency, when the infrastructure, when there is a cyber attack or when there is another threat to the infrastructure of the internet, the principle of sharing of information, of mutual assistance, is these principles are set out in that commitment.
But there's also a sort of other principle that emerged from your work that is a very important one with regards to the extraterritorial impacts that a state could have when it exercises or enforces actually its jurisdiction over operators located on its soil or cross-border traffic. Could you mention this as well?
Yes, absolutely. So this construct of the universality and integrity of the internet is based on this assumption that what happens within one jurisdiction, within the territory of one country, should not impact the accessibility of the internet in another jurisdiction. So this is the premise for asserting the cross-border nature of the internet in the policy. Now, this notion has been taken again in another policy document, which was adopted this year, on the transboundary free flow of information on the internet. There we engaged with the question of states placing restrictions on the content, blocking a website in their jurisdiction, because that website may contain information which is deemed illegal in that jurisdiction. But this doesn't mean that the content is illegal in another jurisdiction. And there are only few types of content on which there is a uniform understanding, international understanding as to what is illegal content, and that includes child pornography or xenophobic and racist content and things, and that type of content. So how do we deal with this type of interference that is blocking of illegal content in one jurisdiction, which has an impact across the borders?
And
this is the question with which we engaged. It's a very difficult question to address. What we stated there in the policy is that really the safety net to avoid a cross-border impact is complying strictly with the conditions of Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and I can elaborate more on the principles of that policy, but by way of introduction, this is how I would frame my intervention, recognizing the cross-border nature of the internet in policy.
I think we are directly at the core of the debate, and also what you mentioned is very important, that there is no universal agreement. Things that can be legal in one country can be illegal in another one, and since we all coexist digitally in cyberspaces and interact across borders on an everyday basis, basically, this poses a completely new set of challenges, as I said in the beginning. I would like to jump to Kostas from Yelp, who's presenting basically the point of view of intermediaries on this issue, because intermediaries are receiving more and more requests from more and more different countries for content takedowns. And by the way, here we focus in this session not on copyright. There's another session on copyright going on right now, but especially everything ranging from hate speech, from defamation, and so on and so forth. How do big companies like Yelp deal with the situation and see the trends? And also, I would like to ask the question, what about smaller actors who do not have the legal capacity that a company like Yelp has?
Many thanks. Actually, I was starting from the last point, because it's very easy for the big players. It's much easier, let's say Google, Facebook, even Yelp, even if we're not so big, to deal with the complexity and the legal uncertainty than for small players. And since we are in a European framework, when you look at the European landscape, 95% of European companies, ICT companies, are small and medium enterprises. Do they have the capacity to engage in legal analysis, legal assessment, complex situations? I'm not sure. And this is the point. There's a lot of uncertainty, even for Yelp. Take the example that I live in Belgium, so I have a Yelp account. I have a contract with Yelp in Brussels. And I'm going to the US, I'm visiting my colleagues there, and I write a review about the restaurant. The restaurant owner is not very happy with what I wrote. And he goes to Yelp and say, like, this is defamatory, like I want to sue Costas because he wrote something bad about my business. So what jurisdiction are we in? Because I have a contract with Yelp in Belgium. Yelp is headquartered in the US. I'm based in Brussels, and the business owner is based, let's say, in New York. So there's a complexity. It's not so easy to find, to define the jurisdiction. And it's true that it's very difficult to duplicate the geographical borders online. And just to be a bit provocative, is like really the cyberspace renders the traditional principles of conflict of law a little bit useless, because the traditional principles are based on territoriality and nationality. Those two principles, when we try to implement them in the cyberspace, it's very difficult, and this is the challenge. And apart from the international landscape, where you mentioned two cases, I'd just like to refer to, for example, the right to be the indexed, or the right to be forgotten, which is wrongly mentioned. It's a very interesting case because actually it was not the court, the European Court of Justice, who said that the scope of the application of the judgment applies to .com domain. It was actually, it's a bit unclear in the judgment. It was actually the data protection authorities of Europe who produced guidelines, and they said that for the judgment to be effective, it needs to apply to .com. And the question is like, do we want the European values to be extended to other states? Can we do that? Can we oblige other states to give away their privilege to make an assessment between fundamental rights, privacy versus freedom of expression? I'm not sure. And also the Delphi case is very interesting because it's an interesting case which shows that, for example, a prohibition, which is in European law, the e-commerce directive, the prohibition against general monitoring, so we have a prohibition de jure, de facto, there's no prohibition. Actually, there's an encouragement to apply general monitoring online. So we have an interpretation of the legal framework that goes to the limit, and the impact is more content being taken down, being removed. The impact on freedom of communication, freedom of expression is huge. So also within the European Union, there is a lot of uncertainty. That does not help the case either for big players or small players.
Talking about the European Union, I would like to go over to Megan. You're working on this major project, which is the European Single Digital Market. Actually, this has a lot to do with the cross-border internet and national laws, because in Europe we have also 28 different national jurisdictions. So what are actually the projects or the things that you're going to tackle under the strategy and under this project, especially with regards to everything that is procedures for removal of content online and all those things that Kostas was mentioning?
Well, thanks very much. We have only a short period of time, so I can't tell you everything.
Yeah, keep it short.
I try to keep it short. So first of all, as you rightly said, the digital single market is really that about making sure that we have a digital single market at European level and to try to remove the fragmentation of the physical world at digital level. As I mentioned this morning, the single market itself, which permitted the freedom of movement of goods, services, capital, and what have I said? Goods, services, people, and capital, of course, has to be extended now to the digital and online world. And that means not necessarily that we get rid of jurisdictions, because by definition, France is going to be France, Germany is going to be Germany. The laws there apply in Germany, the laws apply in France. But what we need is at European level, something that allows us to make these movements work properly and better and well. Now, I'll take one example, which some of you might not like. For the moment, in the context of data protection, we have a data protection directive, which was established many years ago, And it's applied slightly differently, as you know, in each of the different jurisdictions in Europe. So the general data protection regulation was intended to bring one common regulation at European level. This would have made it much easier, first of all, for online companies to work, as well as many other companies. And even though many industries have complained about Article X or Article Y or this provision or that, almost everyone has said if there is one regulation applied uniformly throughout Europe, this, of course, makes our life much easier. And so it's that kind of activity and that kind of change which is foreseen also in the digital single market. And the general data protection regulation is one of the elements that's commented on in the digital single market, saying that this will help. So there are aspects relating to removing unjustified geo-blocking. I mentioned this morning some of the provisions relating to the review of consumer protection legislation. There are also aspects relating to common contract provisions, which will allow better e-commerce, especially cross-border, because e-commerce domestically in Europe is not great, but it's better in some countries than it is in others. Where we really see a problem is cross-border e-commerce. So those are some of the areas where work will be done. There's a whole list, and I would recommend to any of you who are interested to look at the communication itself. It came out on the 6th of May. And of course, we can go into more details later, because I'm sure the audience wants to talk about this in much more detail.
Exactly. Gabrielle, what is actually the perspective of the everyday user on this nexus of different, very complex things that are going on? If users are going on the internet, surfing on the web, are they actually aware of all those challenges, all those problems that states are facing, that companies are facing currently?
Well, actually, first of all, I should say that I'm not representing users as such. But I think that users face an incredibly complex legal environment. First of all, they have to deal with terms and conditions, companies, when they're using services such as Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. Then something they're not always aware of is that they're still subject to the general laws of their country. So that means that, for instance, if they express themselves online, on Twitter or even on Facebook, they may be held liable for it under defamation law, or sometimes for criminal offences. For example, in the UK, the Malicious Communications Act or the Communications Act, and there have been several social media prosecutions for what people said online. The fact that it takes place in a quasi-private environment such as Facebook does not necessarily make a difference, because it really comes down to how the law itself is phrased. So, for example, you have defamation which might be public, but you have also defamation which may happen privately in an email, for instance. And in addition to that, you also have the regime that governs how intermediaries, their activities, and in particular, whether or not they may be held liable for the content of others. And that's just, for example, talking about the system in the European Union. That would be the e-commerce directive. And only talking about here content and freedom of expression. In addition to that, as you flagged up, there is also the issues around access to user data or personal information and how that takes place. Which laws do you apply, like from which country? You also have, for example, for the prosecution of certain crimes or just investigations, the use of mutual legal assistance treaties and how that works. So it's incredibly complex, and I just don't think that users are really able to cope. And I would add that as well as being incredibly complex, it really adds to the legal uncertainty around this. And I would pick up on some of the points that have already been made, for instance, relating to the e-commerce directive. I mean, one of the issues has been because it was a directive, it was implemented in very different ways, and there have been lots of different interpretations as to what constitutes actual knowledge, what is a valid notice. So it's a very complex environment, and I think it must be incredibly difficult for users to navigate it.
So if we sum this up, we are facing currently a situation that is extremely difficult for the users, which even has an impact on very fundamental rights because they don't know how to act in this environment. It is a situation that is incredibly complex for the companies that are facing those requests from all the various jurisdictions all around the world and need to cope with this situation. And of course, it is a very difficult situation for the governments which try to establish very legitimately the rule of law online, but simply do not know how to do it in an interconnected cross-border space. And this brings us to exactly the core of this discussion, which is what frameworks do we need actually to preserve the cross-border nature of the internet? We currently are in a situation where our legal systems today are based upon a principle from 1648 emerging of the Treaty of Westphalia, which is sovereignty and separation of sovereignties. But over the last 20 years or so, we saw the emergence of companies, online spaces that span across multiple jurisdictions. We have content that is accessible worldwide, so there's a huge clash, and we need to find operational solutions because we live in this world today where we have those online spaces, but still we have our traditional legal systems. So I think the legitimate question is, are the traditional cooperation methods of our Westphalian toolkits enough to tackle this challenge, or would this mean to renationalize the internet? Or if we want to preserve the cross-border nature of the internet, does this mean that we need to find new mechanisms, innovative mechanisms, mechanisms that are as innovative as the internet itself? Before we go into the meat of the discussion and to discuss about the possible frameworks, one question for the audience. We are always taking for granted, actually, this notion that we need to preserve the cross-border nature of the internet because of all the economic, political, and social benefits it has brought to mankind. Is this something everybody in this room agrees with, or is there someone who says, no, actually, a slight renationalization would be good or desirable? Any opinions in that regard? No? Okay, yes.
Well, I'm sure there will be lots of comments later, but I just wanted to make a simple comment, and that is that the internet is often spoken of as if it's one single thing, and it's not. It's not. It's a network of networks. It's a whole series of layers upon different layers. It works in a different way. So if you think about the way the network works in China, for example, compared to the way it works in Germany, of course it's different, but that doesn't mean it's not connected globally. So I think perhaps to talk about one single internet is a bit of a misnomer, and we want it to work, and we want it to be resilient and safe and open and all the other good things, but perhaps we should use a different terminology.
I think maybe a good solution in that regard, what we are also doing in the Internet and Jurisdiction project, is to talk about cross-border cyberspaces rather than the cross-border internet, because at the end of the day, the question is, do we refragment cyberspaces on the internet so that they can comply with national law, that there is, I don't know, a German Facebook instead of a global Facebook, and so on and so forth. I would suggest we do the following for this round of questions on the framework. We will give each participant the opportunity to sketch out a specific angle of where we should head in terms of frameworks. And then I would like to hear from the room very quickly in short, succinct comments if they agree or disagree with what was just said. So I would maybe like to start with Kostas. So you mentioned the difficulties that businesses are facing and intermediaries are facing, and since we are talking about those cyberspaces, those cross-border online spaces, most of them are operated by companies. So for large, but also for smaller companies, what would be the ideal framework, basically, a solution to this current situation?
Well, in an ideal world, and in a non-feasible solution, would be a unification of frameworks, procedures across the globe. Of course, we need to be realistic.
The International Internet Court,
exactly.
Harmonization of all speech-related laws.
Exactly, absolutely. In an ideal world, fantastic world. what can really make the difference is legal certainty. This is what we need. And then to focus, because, for example, there's been a lot of discussion about, for example, how to protect human rights, what are the principles, proportionality, effectiveness. The principles are known, the rights are there. The question is always how to implement them in practice, and there is where we struggle. So even if we had an amazing international treaty, then we still have the problem of the implementation, how we put that in reality, in practice.
So operational solutions are needed, not high-level principles?
Exactly, the principles are there. I think everybody can agree on the principles, but how to find the solutions, and then more work on uniform, standardized formats, procedures. For example, because we're in the context of an intermediary receiving requests for unlawful content, how, for example, what are the elements that a notice should include? Guidelines, how to make the assessment between different rights. Is there a time framework for the content to be taken down or to be suspended? Defamation cases, what are the words that are actually problematic? So more focus on the procedures, and then also because the whole discussion is a bit hijacked by the copyright and the copyright infringements and terrorism, national security, there needs to be a distinction between content that is unlawful per se and content that might have been used unlawfully. This is a distinction that is not always made, at least in the public debate. And also in the framework, at least in the European legal framework, we have a horizontal model of intermediary liability that applies horizontally to all types of unlawful content. And it's very difficult to have a discussion about it when you have the copyright infringements, the piracy hijacking the world debate. But copyright infringement is not the same as a defamation, it's not the same as child pornography, it's not the same as national security. And this distinction is not always reflected in the legal frameworks we have.
So to sum up, basically, what you said is we have actually high-level principles, so the challenge is to operationalize them into something that can handle everyday challenges in a way. And in that regard, there's also a work, if I understood correctly, that needs to be done in terms of defining what are actually operational norms and criteria that actors agree upon so that things can be handled, because those requests are coming in today. It's not just because we don't have a solution for them that they don't exist, quite the contrary, they come in because we don't have a solution. I think this is a very important point. So operational procedures versus a global treaty. Who agrees with what Kostas said? Who would second this? And maybe I could get a microphone so that we... There's one. Oh, yeah. So is there agreement from what Kostas said? Is someone disagreeing? Is someone saying that we rather need an international treaty as the first step? Who would like to be first? If there's nothing coming from the floor, Ivana, what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you. I think the answer to that question is not yes or no. It really is more nuanced than that. Yes, on some issues we may need international treaties, and we already have international treaties. For example, the Cybercrime Convention, it's an international treaty. It's a mutual legal assistance treaty, and that's in place.
Yeah.
And that ensures cooperation across borders between law enforcement authorities. So we cannot answer your question in the positive or in the negative. We really have to see by issue, by topic, by what is the subject matter on which we need to have harmonized rules on a substantial level, substantive level, and then on a procedural level. I think this is how I would like to frame the issue.
So
also,
issue by issue,
yeah.
and then decide whether it's possible for some things that everybody can agree upon, which is, for instance, child abuse images. There, of course, you can achieve a certain level of harmonization, whereas there are other things, I'm thinking about defamation, which is a very tricky issue, where there will be no way that there is an international consensus. Maybe one day there's a consensus in the European Union on this, which is a very harmonized space already, but on a global level, I imagine that it's very difficult to achieve.
And since I have the microphone, I also think that the answer to your first question, whether people in the room agree or disagree with whether internet is cross-border, yes, the answer would be yes, of course. But I would add something to that. We should also comprehend, I think fully first, what are the risks to the fragmentation of the internet before embarking on finding solutions to the fragmentation. I know this was a topic of one of your sessions in IGF last year, and I think what is coming across here is the lack of the legal uncertainty is a risk of fragmentation, and this is what we would have to discuss how to address it, without exaggerating the risks, but understanding them realistically.
Yeah. And as I said, I think when we talk about the fragmentation of cyberspaces, there are at least three analytical categories in which we need to understand this if we also talk about the costs of inaction, which is currently happening. This is the current situation. There are obviously economic costs, but there are also political costs, because such disagreement causes not only a lot of tension between governments when they negotiate certain cooperation regimes, certain treaties, but especially when there are single cases, and there have been several high-profile cases. I'm just thinking about the Innocence of Muslim video, which recently the copyright judgment in the United States was reverted, so YouTube can put up the video now again. Such cases really steer diplomatic tensions between states, because there's no solution, there are no procedures how to handle those cases, and also if they touch upon public order issues, which it can also be the case, this is really a political risk in a way. And of course, and most obviously, it's a social risk, because mankind got used to the fact that we can access content globally, we can surf on the internet, we don't care whether the server is stored in the Philippines or somewhere else when we access content. And I think this is actually what makes the internet so fascinating, and why it grew so fast, that we did not think about those things. But now we arrive basically in the realities, and the legal and regulatory frameworks need to catch up in a way. Are there any comments on this issue of fragmentation from remote, or from the floor, or from maybe even the Twitter wall? I did not look at the questions that come from there, so if someone wants to forward them, just raise your arm, and I will give you the mic. Megan, I would like to go over and go back to the European example of the digital single market. So even if there is a level of harmonization, interoperability, efficiency to deal with those things with all the necessary protections achieved on the European level, still Europe exists within the global internet, and European citizens interact not only on European Union platforms, but globally across borders, use services that are not necessarily incorporated in the European Union, use services that are not necessarily have the data stored in Europe. What are the mechanisms what are the directions in which we need to go? What are the operational solutions that we need to look at?
Well, I was going to say something completely different, but I will answer your question first, if I can. So on the DSM, as I said also earlier, the digital single market is not at all intended to be a fortress Europe where we restrict into our own national laws or European laws that exclude everyone else. Not at all. The whole point, as I was saying this morning, is to make sure that we have cross-border exchanges, cross-border information, cross-border flows that make it easier for consumers, businesses, etc. to work. And once we have a European digital single market, that will help us trade also with the rest of the world. Because by very definition, if you have avoidance of unnecessary geo-blocking within Europe, by definition, anyone coming from outside Europe, or vice versa, will find that those flows work better, and that information works better, and the exchanges work better. So that's one thing that I think is very important about the digital single market. And its intention is really to increase trade, increase use of internet, make it better, make it work more efficiently. So by nature, it will also work internationally. better. But there were two things I wanted to raise in the context. One, just a comment on what Ivana said about the Cybercrime Convention, which of course is very good, but I think one reason it's been relatively successful, and of course it's not everyone who signed it, I think, is it 32 states? Well, anyway, whatever the number is, it's growing and more countries are signing up to it, but by its very nature, crime is a governmental public policy issue. Virtually every country in the world knows that it looks after crime. It deals with crime. Whereas the internet as a whole is, and the model of governance of the internet is multi-stakeholder, and we want it to stay multi-stakeholder. So by definition, it shouldn't be just governments, of course, that were to establish perhaps a treaty on everything relating to the internet. We wouldn't want to see that, I don't think. In the context of cybercrime, of course, it's one very specific public policy related governmental issue that can be addressed quite specifically. So it works very well in that aspect and of course can be drawn out. And the other issue I wanted to raise, really more as a discussion than anything else, but it relates also to the jurisdictional issue, is that in the Net Mundial principles, which we were talking about this morning, one element that was raised is the principle that the internet is a global resource which should be managed in the public interest. And therefore, perhaps this is something that we should be looking at in a slightly different way. Instead of trying to address these issues just by way of treaty, maybe we should be looking at things in a different way. I mean, you suggested also, perhaps there are ways and means of doing this in a slightly different way than we have before, by making sure the private sector is involved, industry, technical community, governments by all means, public policy, users, civil society, etc. It's messy, it's complicated, it's not as easy as one might think, but perhaps there are other ways and means of doing this.
And this is the question, if we need to go down this road, and exactly as Ivana said, what issues can be covered by traditional mechanisms, and for what issues do we need new operational, more transnational mechanisms, because the traditional ones are simply too slow, too cumbersome, or not even feasible to establish.
Can I just react to that?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Just very briefly, I mean, first of all, I just wanted to go back on to geo-blocking, because for me it's really one of the ways in which the traditional territorial limits are reasserting themselves in the online in the online space, which I think, you know, as much as geo-blocking is also one way of complying with the proportionality element, for instance, of the human rights framework, it's also reasserting these boundaries. I wanted to briefly react also in relation to the question about crime as a public policy issue. I think it's also very important to remember that it has a tremendous impact on users' rights, human rights, so that would be the right to privacy, also free expression, talking about the Cybercrime Convention. And I think that's why when we're talking about not necessarily just treaties but other means, for me, that's a little worrying, because a lot of the time that means users that come right at the bottom of the list of people that need to be consulted or involved. And that's when we hear about voluntary cooperation and very often bypassing legal procedures. Yeah. That should be respected, because that's what is safeguarding our right to privacy. And by the same token, the right to free expression, when we're talking about, for example, crimes that may be committed allegedly, maybe by a whistleblower or like activists around the world. So I just wanted to add that.
No, and I think it cannot be stressed enough that this touches upon really the fundamental human rights of users, and how they can also be enforced and acted operationally, basically, and especially across borders, because this is the topic of the session. Are there further comments on those issues? And could you please present yourself?
Thank you, Paul. My name is Qian Hong, representing UNESCO. It's a very interesting topic, because at the United Nations, we are also thinking about the need to have a global level framework regarding the internet governance. Actually, we already have some, particularly in terms of international human rights law, such as the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution in 2012 that all the human rights as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 should be equally applied online, offline. And also last year, that the UNGA has adopted the right to privacy in digital age. And at UNESCO, we are also called upon by our member states as a traditional procedure. You mentioned that whether we should have a sort of either binding or non-binding instrument or to govern the internet. And my observation that internet, we are at a transitional era now. It's not a recent issue. I think it's in the past 20 years that the different actors relating to internet, they are all trying to develop certain kind of frameworks. Recently we conducted a study. Actually, so far there are already 52 different frameworks, guidelines, declarations, instruments endorsed or adopted by different actors, including the IGOs, including the civil society. And a very good trend is that we see that more and more civil society are really involved, like what we see in the Night Mondial as well. And UNESCO, we are promoting the Internet Universality framework. I just elaborate a bit. We were talking about 4 major principles which should govern Internet governance. The first one is obviously human rights based, because we perceive all the human rights, not only one of it. For example, now everybody talking about personal data protection, but we see there should be a balance between this right and how it's impacting other rights, like free expression, like the public access to information, also transparency need. So we should really go for a very comprehensive and coherent framework to talk about human rights. And the second principle of universality principle is open internet, both economically and technically. And the third one is about the accessibility as a social dimension. And fourth one is multi-stakeholder participation. I finish here.
Thank you very much. I think those are all very important points. And as you said, there are today 52 different bodies of principles and recommendations already that you mapped. It's very important also to take the historical timeline when we talk about those issues, because for a long time, in the late 1990s, in the early 2010s, we had this, or 0 years, we had this discussion, a very philosophical discussion about what is law in cyberspace, does law even apply in cyberspace or not, but it was a merely philosophical discussion. And over the years, all those online services, the Facebooks, the Twitters, the Yelps, basically they developed and they were suddenly there, but there was never a clear answer to this philosophical discussion that we had almost 15 years ago. And today, we are in a situation where we need operational solutions because we live in the 21st century with all those problems, and they are everyday problems, they are not theoretical problems. Could you please present yourself?
I'm Bertrand Lachapelle from the Internet and Jurisdiction Project, but I want to piggyback on 2 things that have been said. Elvana has very importantly raised this distinction between harmonization on substance and harmonization on procedures. Cybercrime Convention is a perfect example where there was a desire to harmonize on substance, and it was actually possible because there was a possibility of having dual incrimination, and the whole architecture is based on establishing cooperation mechanisms once people have agreed that it is dual incrimination, which is one of the major obstacles in the MLAT system. It is not always possible, hence the distinction that there can be efforts to harmonize on procedures. But to come back to what Megan was saying, what is very interesting is even if the end result is something that is adopted by governments, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has not been drafted or elaborated in a larger multi-stakeholder capacity. And the examples of the recommendations that you mentioned regarding transboundary harm, the universality of the internet, I was honored to participate in the process that actually led to the drafting of those documents. And that was developed by a multi-stakeholder group and an ongoing process that was then validated by the Committee of Ministers. And I want to give credit to ISOC at the global level, which actually has recently issued a document explaining that even on security matters, there is a need for having a broad multi-stakeholder discussion, even if in the end it ends up being documents that are validated or rules that are adopted by the governments. So it's not a contradiction or it's not an either or. Sometimes you have harmonization on procedures and substance. Sometimes you have only on one. And even when it is a governmental discussion in the end, or even a treaty, it can have been elaborated in a multi-stakeholder manner.
Are there more questions either on the process of how to produce such frameworks or actually the content of such frameworks? Gabrielle?
Just wanted to react quickly to what Bertrand was saying about harmonization in relation to content and procedure. Just to reiterate that human rights law helps harmonizing that content aspect in relation to defamation, for instance. The European Court has said that, or at least found a violation every time that a state had imposed criminal penalties on someone who'd made a defamatory comment. So that's one way of harmonizing things. But it's always tricky because even when you look at all these various instruments and treaties or like the directive, a lot of the time they give the high-level principles, but there's always like exceptions, including with the Cybercrime Convention, because the defenses might not be the same, the standard for knowledge and is not necessarily the same. So I think we still have those difficulties. But I think that generally speaking, seems to me that the key things that we need to work on and get better at is clarity, transparency, and procedural mechanisms to protect users' rights. And that applies, I think, on all levels. And that applies also to terms and conditions. That also applies to, for example, rules on intermediary liability, and all the various other conventions that we've talked about. And actually, I mean, maybe I'm already going ahead of my time here, but that's one of the things they've been trying to do with a broad coalition of civil society groups in developing the Manila Principles on Intermediary Liability. Today, there are close to 60 organizations that have endorsed these principles. There are over 130 individuals who signed on to them. And so what we're trying to do...
What do they say? Can you, for those who don't know what the Manila Principles are?
The Manila Principles deal with intermediary liability. And so they represent our view of what are the baselines to protect intermediaries from undue rules on liability. And so there are a number of aspects. It applies, it's very much horizontal, but it's much more detailed when it comes to the procedural rules that we think are the right ones to protect intermediaries and users when it comes to content removal, for instance, like in the context of website blocking or, as I said, when you have either an individual law enforcement agency seeking the removal of content. I mean, I'm very happy to expand further on various aspects.
Well, if you maybe could just give us like the three most important aspects or principles that this document puts forth and that we need to keep in mind from your perspective in those discussions about frameworks. What would those three be?
Like the first basic principle is that intermediaries should not be held liable for third-party content in circumstances where they have not intervened themselves in that content. The second basic principle is that we don't support notice and takedown procedures because we think that has a chilling effect on free expression. And so the principles detail what we think are better alternatives to protect free expression and privacy rights. So that includes court-based models to require content to be removed, or notice and notice procedures that I'm happy to expand on. So these are some of the core principles. At the same time, we also recognize that platforms are free to decide how they want to set the rules on their own platforms. So we recognize some flexibility there. But again, we think that terms and conditions should be extremely clear about what's permitted and what's not, and have complaint mechanisms in place, especially when it comes to content removal on the basis of terms and conditions, because very often there's no such mechanism when content is removed. And actually there's an interesting case at the moment in France where an individual has gone before the courts to challenge the removal of one of his postings that included a painting, L'Origine du Monde, very famous painting, and so it was removed. And interestingly,
it was even his whole entire account that was suspended, or was it just this piece of content that was removed?
I believe it was the content with the painting itself,
yeah.
which was removed because it presents like a female sex. And so, interestingly, Facebook terms and conditions say that the Californian courts are competent to deal with these matters, but the French courts asserted that jurisdiction in that case. So it'll be very interesting to see what they think of like the way in which Facebook applied as terms and conditions. Thank you.
And I think this is a very important aspect, what you just said, what your last sentence. Courts start increasingly to ignore those clauses in terms of service that put the jurisdiction of online platforms that the citizens of their states are using, and assert jurisdiction if it involves the citizens, because they say, okay, if the entire population is using the service and is interacting online, spending a considerable amount of time using those services every day, there is no reason not to assert jurisdiction over those things if they are happening in France. And this is at the core, basically, this trend is at the core of the rise of requests that we see, because...
yeah, it's also a question of access to justice.
Talking about access to justice, talking about mechanisms for users, for their complaints. Ivana, I would like to ask you, because the Council of Europe did a lot of work on those issues, and you also did work on users' rights across borders and on the internet, basically. What mechanisms do we need to have to enforce users' rights across borders? I mean, if it's a national case, there are channels for complaints, for legal recourse, but those do not necessarily exist across borders. Litigation in foreign jurisdictions is out of reach for like most everyday internet users. So how can we change the situation? What needs to be developed in that regard?
Thank you. We developed a guide to human rights for internet users, and there we try to explain in simple terms to internet users what their fundamental rights and freedoms online are. Now, there is a fundamental right to an effective remedy, and this is what we are talking about here. When users are unhappy and feel that their rights have been violated, they should have an effective remedy. This is a guaranteed right in the European Convention on Human Rights. In practice, it's very difficult to enforce this right for the reasons that you just mentioned. What needs to happen is that the internet-based platforms, such as social networks, they need to put in place mechanisms which inform users about their rights. And this information should not be too much complicated, but it should be accessible to an average internet user. It should not be legalistically charged with too many legal notions. There should be clauses in their terms of services, for example, about due process of interaction between the user and the internet service provider. For example, content that is produced by users should not just be removed by the social platform because the social platform considers it inappropriate according to its community standards. There should be a due process of notifying the user about what the infringement is, perhaps of offering a voluntary withdrawal of the content by the user before removing the content. And then if the content is ultimately removed, there should be an appeals mechanism, for example, in these social networks. This is about freedom of expression implications. There are other elements about the protection of the right to privacy, which is a different interaction needs to happen there. Users need to be informed about the amount of data, personal data and information that is collected from them and that is retained, for which purpose this is retained, and there needs to be consent by the user and awareness by the user when giving that consent about the usage of personal information, the purposes for using the personal information. So these should be embedded in the frameworks that govern the relationship between the user and the internet service provider or the platform provider.
And basically, and I think something that is also important to mention is, and you already said this, that it's affordable, basically, that the average user can afford such procedures. I would like to give the floor to the audience. What do you think about this question? You heard a lot of elements regarding the way how to build frameworks, so what are the procedures to build actually different frameworks addressing the specific challenges that we see online. And we also heard a lot about the different elements that should be in such frameworks. And I would be interested if this resonates with what you are thinking, what you heard, if you have other angles that need to be discussed when we're talking about what frameworks we need that were not mentioned yet, or if you would just to comment on something that the speakers already said. Yes, please. Please state your name and your affiliation.
Thank you. I'm Jotor Hassan of Sekua, and I have a couple of questions. I think the user, yes, he is concerned about the content, but he is also concerned about what recourse he has when he buys products on the line. Let me give you an example. It's becoming very popular now to buy something online from China. Sooner or later, there will be problems with something. What kind of a recourse does the user have? What channels can he employ? That is my first question. If I may, another one?
Of course.
We are talking very much about the European single market. But I have the feeling that we are a bit late, because around the corner is the transatlantic treaty. We are looking there at a market, 300 million Americans, 500 million Europeans, together 800 million people, and this sounds very much like a single market. Now the Americans probably have their own frameworks, I assume, and now we are talking about European frameworks. How will this work out? Are we going to get a transatlantic framework, or how do you see this? This is not the future, this is just around the corner.
Very interesting questions. So consumer protections and trade agreements. Who would like to comment on this from the panel? Yes, Megan, please. Do you have a mic?
Right in front of me, no wonder I can't see it. Well, I'll start with the TTIP aspect, and perhaps Kostas would like to deal with the consumer protection issue, because he used to work for the European Consumer Protection Group. So on TTIP specifically, the idea is not that there will be harmonization between the United States and Europe of all our legislation or trade provisions or anything, not at all. It's a whole series of means and ways of trying to improve the way we trade and invest in each other's respective areas. So it includes a whole series of things like mutual recognition of standards. Just to use an example that sometimes is easy to understand, if I don't have a Mercedes, but if I had a Mercedes-Benz, if my Mercedes-Benz works perfectly well in Germany and in France and in Belgium and in Greece and everywhere else I drive, and is considered to be safe and reliable, et cetera, why is it that it can't be used in the United States with exactly the same safety provisions, et cetera? And the same for the American Ford, which is considered to be safe for an American to drive in Missouri or in Minnesota. Why could it not be recognized as equally safe in Europe? So those relate to mutual recognition of standards. That's one area that's really important. Another is interoperability. So things that work in Europe should be able to work in the United States, etc. There's another area where a lot of progress, I think, can be made. Then, of course, there are all the investment-related aspects. The establishment of the European single market for goods, services, capital, and people already increased dramatically the way in which Europe trades with its trading partners and increased trade and made it much easier to trade. So the idea is to improve also investment both between Europe and the United States, and this will also increase and improve the way in which investment and trade takes place throughout the rest of the world. It is not to impose necessarily a Euro-American system on everyone else, but if you see that trade increases and investment increases in those two big trading blocks, others will say, well, why not? I can adapt to some of those standards or other elements that help me also trade with those. So that's one element. I could say something on consumers, but I leave it to Kostas too.
So what about consumer rights? And I think if you would not mind, I would like to even open up this question a bit broader, because you talked about consumer protection for physical goods that are acquired over the internet. But maybe you can give, with your past experience, even a broader perspective on the role of consumer protection in general, if we talk about those challenges and all those requests to legal frameworks and so on and so forth.
Well, I think on some aspects, the consumer protection framework can be a source of inspiration, and on others, it can get inspiration from other pieces of legislation. I always made the link between consumer protection and data protection, and I will explain what I mean. To get the example of the consumer who buys something from China and arrives, it's defective, it doesn't work. Under EU law, you have the right to get a remedy, to get the product returned. Good luck with that. How are you going to enforce this right when the trader is in China? It's impossible. And it's even worse, because even within the European Union, under existing cooperation of enforcement authorities framework, consumer authorities do not have power to enforce laws cross-border. And one of the positive elements of the digital single market is that there is a discussion to give more enforcement powers to the cooperation network of consumer protection authorities. This is really needed, because even within the EU, there's no cross-border coordination of enforcement. What I meant before about getting inspiration from the data protection is very interesting, because under the data protection regulation that is currently being discussed, there is a provision that any service that is targeted to the European citizen will have to comply with EU law. Fantastic, very consumer friendly. How are you going to enforce it? One of the elements in order to solve this problem was that any provider, any service provider targeting European consumers has to have a representative within the EU. This is quite a clever way. At least if as a consumer I have a problem, I can always go to the representative of that service provider and claim my rights. And of course, it's important that I can always go to my national authority in order to launch a complaint. I will never go to Norway, Dublin, or Portugal in order if I'm in Greece. It's important to have the possibility to lodge a complaint. And then about TTIP, I think this, in this framework, we need more discussion about cooperation, about enforcement between the authorities, and the TTIP could be a starting point in order to bring more the enforcement authorities closer.
I think this is something, if I just pick on this one word, enforcement, that is at the core of the problems that we have, because it's one thing to assert jurisdiction, as the French court did in this case with this Facebook post, and another thing is how to enforce national jurisdiction. So just because a court decides that something needs to be removed from the internet because it infringes the law in a given state, does not mean that a country has actually the means and the procedures at hand to actually do this. A company might be incorporated abroad, it might be a company where you do not know how to access it, where the channels are, how to submit your valid document, basically. And those are very pragmatic, very simple challenges, basically, but those are everyday challenges. And so it becomes very interesting to see also that there are some countries that can enforce their jurisdictions because they have the operators on their soil, and this raises what Ivana was mentioning, then questions with regards to the extraterritorial extension of their sovereignty over citizens from other states that use the same services, for instance. And at the same time, you have the situation where you have, for instance, a court decision, you cannot enforce it. What do you do? The last resort, basically, for countries, and this goes again into this direction of progressive renationalization or reshaping cyberspaces so that they are in conformity with national laws in the absence of cooperation, is blocking. So you block entire platforms. And under those circumstances, it can happen that an entire platform is blocked because of one piece of content, which is not proportionate, which is not good for the safeguarding of freedom of expression and those values. So this is a very tricky issue. I would love to hear more comments from the floor. Yes, please. And please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. My name is Alex Blom. I'm from the Dutch chapter of the Internet Society. There was a very interesting example of buying a good from China, for instance, as a European consumer, and then the question is whether European consumer law will protect you if you receive the Chinese item and it's defective. I just went online and went to Alibaba, and if you look at Alibaba, it has a lot of buyer protection. You get your money back, you can get your shipping, the shipping fee back. So really the question is, do we need laws from governments when platforms like Alibaba wisely protect their buyers in order to protect their own reputation?
So is it more efficient if platforms just regulate this and those issues? It can be e-commerce issues, like they were mentioned. It can be removal of content, freedom of expression related issues. Is the easy solution to say, well, okay, we are in this Westphalian world. There are operators of cyberspaces. Those spaces span across multiple jurisdictions at once. Their terms of service are the quasi law or constitution of those digital spaces. So isn't it just easier to let the companies basically handle this because they constitute a form of harmonized spaces across borders? Yes, please.
To just briefly react to this comment, it seems to me there are two issues here, like one which relates to the enforcement of the obligations under the contract, and the second one is if matters escalate, where do you go? Like, what's the right fora? If you want to litigate it, then, you know, which courts are competent to hear the case, and what is the applicable law? And that would traditionally be, I mean, some of these matters may well be in the terms and conditions, as we've seen also, for instance, in the case of Facebook, and you'd have some conventions. Obviously, you'd have to check which countries are parties to these conventions when you have a conflict of laws issue in relation to contractual matters.
But I think what was very interesting in talking about Alibaba was this concept, basically, that Alibaba is in conformity, maybe not necessarily with EU standards, but it has procedures. So is it easier to just follow those because there are procedures and they seem to work, or do we need to have the European standards, the French standards, the British standards, the Spanish standards? I think this was, for me, the interesting part of his question.
But, well, this is just a personal comment, so don't take it too seriously. But in a globalized world where people buy and sell things from everywhere all the time, isn't it really a question of trust and confidence in the seller? I mean, you build up trust and confidence in a particular organization or customer provider relationship over some time because of guarantees, etc., Alibaba, Amazon, etc. Many of these online organizations know very well how important these aspects are, and they build them into their systems, rightly so, because they know that building confidence and trust from the consumers is something that's going to keep them in business. I mean, there are all sorts of organizations and online companies who say, buy it, if you don't like it, send it back. And they make their reputation in business on the basis of that. So this is, again, unfortunately, an element of caveat emptor. You know who you buy from to a certain extent, or do you trust them? I'm not entirely convinced that we can come down with a huge legislative approach that's going to save every single consumer everywhere, every time. On the other hand, I agree with you that there are certain cases that have to go to court or others that you want to have at least a basic framework.
I think this what you just mentioned, first a gentleman and then I come to you. What you just mentioned about trust is very important because not only in this very specific context that you mentioned, but in the broader context of why the internet works as well as it does today. If you think about how it currently works, if law enforcement agencies and so on and so forth submit requests to platforms, there as well, in the absence of any agreed upon international frameworks, treaties and so on and so forth, a lot is working today based on trust relationships, but it works remarkably well still, but those are not scalable basically. So I think this notion of trust, if we talk also about what frameworks need to be built, a large part of this is also trust building in a way. Could you please introduce yourself?
Sure, Dan York from the Internet Society, and you actually made a good part of my point I was going to make. So,
oh, sorry.
No, that's fine. I think it's not just trust and looking for confidence in the. Megan Richards said the comment about it's trust and confidence in the seller. It's also trust and confidence in the system, in the overall interaction that we have in the internet, in the network of networks, and the trust that we have that security and privacy of the combination. I think to your point, the internet is working, has been working, has continued to work, largely because it is based on these collaborative trust relationships, the environment that has been developed in a multi-stakeholder fashion between the network operators that actually operate the base of the internet, the businesses, the law enforcement, and all the people who get together and work with that. If we look at the growing the number of CSIRTs, the computer security incident response teams, and the other organizations like that have been working and developing these mechanisms. These they may not be formal frameworks, but they are informal, collaborative environments in which people are working together to solve these issues, both through forums such as this here, with the conversations that are happening here, in a lot of the network operator groups that happen around the world, in a lot of the other different forums where people are providing this kind of mechanism. So I think it's really a question of how do we continue to build and enhance the trust in the overall system that's out there. I love the point about it is a network of networks, and what we talk about here doesn't necessarily apply to all the networks that are out there, but there are some base commonalities, and there are some, it really comes back to the collaboration between what we do.
Thank you. There was another question, comment, remark here in the front. Please let us know who you are.
Louise Bennett, BCS, the Chartered Institute for IT. I've just wanted to comment on the Alibaba case. Alibaba would never have grown to the size it was if it hadn't taken account of the cultural norms in China, where buyers and sellers don't trust each other if they don't know each other. So in effect, their whole system is based on standing in escrow between the buyer and the seller, which is in fact a model that would make a lot of sense in Europe too. The big problem, as you've said, is how about if I think I've bought something from Alibaba, but it wasn't actually Alibaba, it was some fraudulent site pretending to be Alibaba. At that point, how do I get redress? Because MLATs take years to sort out, no one does anything about it, and I've lost my money and lost trust in doing internet commerce, even though I trusted Alibaba.
And also we need solutions that operate at internet speed and not at the speed of very exceptional cases that involve an investigation related to a murder across borders, which used to be something very rare. And so we are talking about things that happen every day, and we all see the transparency reports that the different companies are publishing. And we see the rise of requests, and as more and more courts assert their jurisdiction, more law enforcement agencies assert their national jurisdictions, this trend is going to grow. And before I pass on the mic to the speakers to comment on what they heard and also what resonated from this discussion, I want to take the opportunity that I'm moderating this session to draw your attention also, because we're talking about what frameworks to address this issue, about the work of the Internet and Jurisdiction Project very briefly. So there's a flash update session tomorrow at 11 a.m. and I invite you all to attend this session if you're interested. In a nutshell, we are facilitating, as the neutral facilitator, a global dialogue process between over 80 key entities from all the different stakeholder groups, including the international organizations, including governments, including law enforcement, including internet platforms, technical operators, civil society, and academia, to develop a transnational due process framework for the internet. So a transnational due process framework for how requests are transmitted and handled across borders. So 11 a.m. tomorrow morning. And I would like to give the mic now, maybe we start with Elvana. What is your takeaway? If you would take away one or two things from this discussion, what would it be?
The first thing I would take away is a need, which I view it as a need to have more lawyers specialized in private international law engaged in this debate, which is very important. To have more judges who actually are confronted with requests which have a cross-border dimension. To have more lawyers who really can get down to the questions when a court can assert.
Very briefly, are there lawyers in the room? Who's a lawyer? Please raise your hand. 4 out of roughly 40, 50, okay.
So lawyers specialized, and I repeat this, in private international law, judges as well. It's very important to continue this dialogue so that we get to answers to the questions which we repeat in one form or another in this debate. When can a court assert jurisdiction, personal jurisdiction? When it asserts jurisdiction, which law does it apply? When there are conflicting laws which are applicable to the same case. And when a judgment is delivered, how is that enforced across the borders? So these are the three critical jurisdictional questions which need really an informed participation by lawyers. Thanks.
Megan, please. Or would anybody quickly comment on what Ivana said? Agree, disagree? Okay, Megan. Or
there are not enough lawyers in the room to agree.
You have the final word.
If the room was full of lawyers, they'd all agree. Well, my takeaway is that the digital single market is even more important than I thought it was when I came in this morning. And of course, I think it's important and know it's important. But really, it's a question also of making it work and getting it going as soon as possible. And I know some of you think that the European Commission is going to solve all problems tomorrow. This is not something that the European Commission can do on its own, by itself, even though all the commissioners are behind this. This is something that everyone has to do. The European Parliament, the ministers, the member states, users, civil society, everyone has to back this and make sure that this really moves forward. Because it's not a question of removing jurisdiction, it's a question of making the internet work domestically, if you like, at EU level, but also that will expand and improve our global situation.
Thank you very much. Any direct comments? Okay, Kostas, what is your takeaway?
So my first takeaway is that, which one of the last points discussed, is the increasingly importance of the increasing normative power of terms of service as compared to traditional adoption of regulation to legislation, which is quite, I think the problem will become even more obvious from now on, and needs to be addressed. And the other one, I fully agree on the need to distinguish between substance and procedures. And procedures, businesses really need some pragmatic solutions that will help provide legal certainty and make sure that content is not taken down unlawfully. And on that front, more work on standardization of procedures can only be of help.
Does this resonate with everybody in the room? All right, good. Gabrielle, you had a comment and also your takeaway.
Yeah,
or maybe the comment is
well,
your
takeaway. I guess
takeaway.
I'll start with a comment. I mean, I completely agree with Elvana, although I suspect that a lot of these things, would be decided on a case-by-case basis, because, there are always standards like domicile or, clause in a contract that are applicable, but the difficulty is often in the application. The second point I wanted to make to conclude was to really invite all of you to have a look at the Manila Principles, because this has been...
there was also, you wanted me to show the website, right?
If possible.
Let's see if it works. No, I'm sorry, if someone can do it over there.
This is an attempt to get clearer rules when it comes to procedures, complaint mechanisms, how should content be removed to be in line with international standards on human rights and free expression. So to try and get better at this, to encourage more clarity, transparency, better protection of internet users' rights by having effective procedures and appeals mechanisms in place. So that's really what I'd like to see. And being able to use that perhaps as a starting point to work with other stakeholders, policymakers, businesses to improve on that. Thank you.
And I think unless, are there comments on those things from the room? I would also love to hear your takeaway. Anybody wants to share?
I was just going to make one other completely unrelated comment, if I may, since no one seems to be talking from the audience. I just wanted to comment on something that has nothing to do with jurisdiction, but it has to do with internet governance. Yesterday, when I first came to the Southeast European discussion, the very first panel was all male, so of course there were a lot of comments. The next panel I was on, so there was one woman. This morning there was one woman on a panel, I think we were about 5 or 6. Then I was on a panel 50-50, and now I'm on a panel where there are 3 women. So I guess things are improving. So I suppose tomorrow, so that's just a comment, because no one is talking. But since I wanted to make one other publicity comment, and that is that at 4:30 is the next session, isn't it? At 4:30 there's this session on the Global Internet Policy Observatory, which is something the Commission has paid for, to provide access to information about internet governance for everyone, and it's to try to make sure that everyone contributes to it. So I just wanted again to make one publicity comment, if I may, since I have the microphone.
Of course.
To encourage those of you who are interested to go and see how it can work for you, what you can do to contribute to it, how you can make it something that really helps you. It's not a consumer protection related issue, it's not jurisdiction related, but
are there some takeaways from the floor that you would like to share? And please let me know if there are things from remote participants. We still have 4 minutes.
Thank you. Just as a Chinese consumer living in Europe, I want to share a little bit of comment about Alibaba and also my experience shopping in Europe. Yes, Alibaba never cheat, and because you can do the payment after you get the product, even it's delivered from Shanghai to Paris. I bought a lot from AliExpress, and I never disappointed. But when I shop something in Europe, including Dacty.com in France, the biggest, then I didn't get the delivery. And then when I call the companies, no, it's not our responsibility. You should call the post office. Anyways, I didn't really know where I should go to get my product. So I think that this is also a matter of self-regulatory framework of platform and how it collaborates with the governmental regulation. You see that once a company, intermediaries, they have a very proper, better accountability in their self-regulatory framework, it can really help them to work, to function in a more healthy, enabling environment. It can avoid the improper over-regulation from governments. So I really think that maybe in this topic, there should be a good practice sharing of the self-regulatory of the platforms, which can help to inform the governmental regulatory frameworks.
Very interesting. Are there more comments from the floor? Yes, please. And please let us know who you are.
Thank you. I'm Saimia Thaci. I'm from Kosovo. My question is if any customer doesn't bring the products during the plan, do you have any legislation to, for example, to put in a blacklist when the other customers go to make any applying to see the company is in a blacklist? Thank you.
I think there's, of course, the rating systems and platforms, but is there some European register? Something we all need to look up after this session. Two last takeaways from this session from the audience before we close. Bertrand?
So Bertrand Lachapelle, Internet and Jurisdiction Project. A quick follow-up on what Elvena said regarding the expression of conflict of law and the importance of having judges being involved. I fully agree, but I just want to add one element, which is a traditional way of handling conflicts of law is a very binary thing. You get two different sets of laws and you say either it's law A or law B. If you look at content takedown and, for instance, Twitter partial withholding of access of content in some jurisdiction, geo-IP blocking, or the Google local lenses, it is actually sometimes law A and law B. Like you filter it in country A, but you still make it accessible in the rest of the world, which is the whole debate about the right to be de-indexed and so on. So sometimes it's different because there are overlapping and combinations of laws that are possible. And the other point is more a comment for Gabrielle. I think what I take out is a confirmation of one of the big challenges, which is a key notion of due process is appeal mechanisms, and it goes to remedy also. The problem is we know how to do this at a national level, but appeal mechanism on a transnational basis is very difficult because it cannot be the court in the country where the person is, because then it would be applied in worldwide, and it cannot be only the court of the country where the platform is, because it's also incurring costs and so on. And so how to combine the role that the platforms are playing, and do they have a role in helping set up some sort of appeal mechanism, is a huge issue. And I don't have an answer, but it's an issue that is different from due process at the national level, where we have a judiciary order and we don't have it at the international level. So I just want to insert this idea because it's something that is bugging me.
Elvena wanted to quickly comment on this.
Maybe I can follow up bilaterally, but what I wanted to say is that private international law is really full of these types of situations, and we can learn a lot from what already exists, international agreements in various fields of law. This is the point I wanted to make. I think this is what the private international law lawyers can bring to the table, the experience in dealing with conflicts of law situations.
Yep. And also innovative mechanisms to deal with those things, because it's not the first. The internet is maybe the area where it's most evident that we have those clashes, because it's so fast and so much cross-border. You don't have the latency of physical travel of goods and so on and so forth. But yes, there are other things where mechanisms have been developed. I think if I think about my personal takeaway from this session, first of all, I think that today we are at a stage where the question of if actors are aware that this jurisdiction question, basically this cross-border internet and law question, is not an emerging topic anymore. I feel that it arrived basically at the center of the internet governance debate, and that more and more actors are starting to really deal with those issues, address those issues. And I think we are ripe basically to develop operational solutions. This is what I heard from be it treaties, be it conventions for the things that can be harmonized, be it other procedures for things where it's more appropriate. But what I heard from most comments is also that we need to find solutions basically to those pressing comments. So thanks a lot for the great discussion. Thanks a lot for your comments. And if you're interested in those issues, the discussion will also continue tomorrow at 11 on the Internet and Jurisdiction Project update. Yep.